The silence in our home in Oak Creek, Illinois, wasn't the kind of silence you find in a library or a sleeping forest. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that rings in your ears until you want to scream just to prove you still have a voice. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 10 years I believed I was the architect of the perfect American life. I had a thriving construction business, a restored Victorian home on a tree-lined street, and Sarah. Sarah was the centerpiece of it all. She was an architect by trade, a woman of sharp angles and soft smiles. When we married a decade ago, I felt like I'd won a lottery I hadn't even entered. But lately, the woman I shared a bed with felt like a holograph. She was physically there, but her spirit seemed to be broadcasting from a different frequency. The late nights at her firm, Miller and Associates, had transitioned from occasional deadlines to a permanent state of being. I remember sitting in our kitchen, watching her stir a cup of coffee she hadn't taken a sip of in 20 minutes. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the granite countertop, her thumb tracing the edge of her phone with a rhythmic, anxious motion. When I asked her what she was thinking about, she didn't jump. She just slowly turned her gaze toward me, her expression unreadable. "Just the Henderson project, Elias," she'd say. "The structural integrity is complicated." Little did I know, it wasn't the building's integrity she was worried about. It was ours. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and let us know where you're watching from. Now, I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. I noticed the phone was always face down now. I noticed the way she'd take calls in the garden, her voice a low murmur that vanished the moment I opened the sliding glass door. You feel it in your marrow before you see it with your eyes. The cold realization that the person you know best is becoming a stranger. The catalyst for the end of my life arrived on a Tuesday. I was at the local hardware store in downtown Oak Creek, grabbing some supplies for a kitchen remodel I was supervising. When I walked back to my Ford F-150, I saw it, a plain cream-colored manila envelope tucked firmly under the windshield wiper. My first thought was that it was an angry flyer from a competitor or a neighbor complaining about my parking. But when I pulled it out, I saw my name written in bold, black marker. No stamps, no return address. Inside was a single, high-resolution photograph. It was Sarah's white Lexus. It was parked in the lot of the Blue Spruce Motel in Willow Creek, a town 2 hours west of our home, a place Sarah had no business being. The date and timestamp in the corner of the photo hit me like a physical blow. Last Thursday, 11:45 p.m. That was the night Sarah told me she was sleeping on the sofa at the office because the storm was too bad for the commute. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine idling, the heater blasting air that suddenly felt freezing. I stared at the photo until the pixels blurred. My heart wasn't just breaking, it was recalibrating. I wanted to drive home and throw the photo in her face. I wanted to scream, but 10 years of marriage to a woman like Sarah had taught me that she was a master of logic. So she would have an excuse. She'd say a friend was staying there, or she got lost in the rain. To catch a shadow, you have to become one. I realized I couldn't do this with my own hands. I needed someone who lived in the dark. I found Julian Vance through a contact in the construction industry, a guy who used him to track down contractors who skipped out on bills. Vance didn't have a website with flashy graphics. He didn't have a billboard. He had a cramped, narrow office above a 24-hour dry cleaner in a gritty corner of Chicago. The air in the hallway smelled like industrial starch and old cigarettes. When I walked in, Vance didn't look up from his desk. He was a man in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a very tired piece of oak. He had silver hair cropped close to the scalp and eyes that seemed to see right through my skin and into the mess of my internal organs. I laid the photo from the windshield on his desk. He didn't pick it up. He just leaned back, his chair creaking in the silent room. "You're Elias Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. "Construction, solid reputation, nice house in the suburbs." "I need to know if my wife is having an affair," I said, my voice cracking on the last word. Vance sighed, a long, weary sound. "Everyone wants to know until they actually know. Once I hand you a report, Elias, your life as you know it is over. There's no hitting the undo button. You sure you want to trade your comfortable lie for a jagged truth?" I pushed a stack of bills across the table. a retainer that felt like I was paying for my own autopsy. Hey, I'm already living a lie, Julian. I just want to know how big it is. He nodded slowly, took the money, and told me to wait for his call. Waiting is a special kind of hell. Every time Sarah smiled at me over dinner, I wondered if she'd just come from the blue spruce. Every time she kissed my cheek before leaving for work, I felt the ghost of another man's touch on her skin. I was a prisoner in my own home, playing the role of the doting husband while my soul was screaming for release. 4 days later, Vance called. We met at a diner called the Rusty Spoon on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place where the coffee was burnt and nobody asked questions. Vance pushed a thin blue folder across the table. Her name is Sarah, but she isn't just seeing one person, Vance began, his voice low. I felt the air leave my lungs. She's been frequenting a high-end apartment complex in the Gold Coast. Unit 402. The lease is under the name of a corporation, Sterling Developments. And the man she's meeting there? That's Julian Sterling. He slid a photo out of the folder. It was Sarah, looking more radiant than I'd seen her in years, walking arm in arm with a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a tech magazine. He was younger than me, sharper, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. They were laughing, not just a polite chuckle, but a deep, intimate laugh that suggested a history I knew nothing about. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. I stared at her hand on his arm, the same hand that had worn my ring for a decade. The betrayal felt like a fever. I drove home that evening in a daze, the blue folder hidden under the spare tire in the back of my truck. When I walked through the front door, the smell of roasted chicken hit me. Sarah was in the kitchen, wearing an apron, a glass of red wine in her hand. She looked like the perfect suburban wife. "Hey, stranger," she said, walking over to give me a kiss. I flinched, but I tried to mask it as a sneeze. "Tough day at the site? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired, Sarah," I muttered, heading for the stairs. "A lot of problems with the foundation on the Newberry job." "Foundations are tricky," she said, her voice light and airy. "If you don't get them right at the start, the whole thing eventually leans, doesn't it?" I locked myself in the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. She was talking about a house, but I knew she was unknowingly describing our life. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. I was a lie. She was a lie. We were a house built on sand, and the tide was coming in fast. I realized then that I couldn't stop at just proving an affair. There was something about the way she looked at Sterling in those photos. It wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something professional. The next morning I called Vance from a burner phone. "I want everything," I told him. "I don't just want photos of them together. I want to know where she's getting her money. I want to know about Sterling Developments. I want to know what she does when she thinks nobody's looking." Vance sounded almost impressed. "That's going to cost more, Elias. We're talking deep background, financial forensics, maybe some creative surveillance." "Do it," I said. "I'll sell the truck if I have to." Over the next week, the reports started coming in via encrypted email. The information was staggering. Vance found a secondary bank account Sarah had opened 3 years into our marriage. She had been funneling small amounts, 500 here, 1,000 there, from our joint savings into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But it wasn't just the money. Sarah's business trips to Miami and Scottsdale were becoming frequent. Vance tracked her flight records. She wasn't attending architecture conferences. She was checking into boutique hotels under her maiden name, Sarah Jenkins, and meeting with a group of individuals who had no connection to the construction or design industry. They were all connected to Julian Sterling. "Elias, oh wait, we need to talk in person." "Now." Vance's voice on the phone sounded different, sharper, more urgent. We met at his office, this time, late at night. The dry cleaner downstairs was closed, and the building felt haunted. Vance had a map spread out on his desk, pinned with photos and bank statements. "This isn't just a midlife crisis or a tawdry affair," he said, pointing to a document. "I ran Julian Sterling's background. He's not a developer. Well, he is, but it's a front. He specializes in discrete asset relocation. He helps people, high net worth people, move money and identities when they need to disappear." My heart began to thud against my ribs. What does that have to do with my wife? Vance pulled out a photocopy of a document Sarah had signed 2 weeks ago. It was a transfer of deed. She was preparing to sell a property in Oregon that I didn't even know she owned. But the shocker was the name on the deed. It wasn't Sarah Thorne. It wasn't even Sarah Jenkins. It was Elena Sterling. "She's been using your marriage as a cover, Elias," Vance said, his voice unusually soft. "For 10 years, you've been the perfect, clean background for a woman who has been living a double life. She's not just cheating on you, she's using you as a shield." I sat in the dim light of Vance's office feeling like the world was tilting on its axis. 10 years, 3,650 days I had spent with this woman. I thought I knew her childhood stories, her favorite movies, her deepest fears. But the woman I loved was a construct, a character played by an actress named Elena. And Vance handed me a second passport he'd managed to photograph from her private safe deposit box. The face was unmistakably Sarah's, the same high cheekbones, the same piercing green eyes. But the name was Elena Sterling. The place of birth was listed as Madrid, Spain. My Sarah, the woman who claimed she was born in a small town in Oregon and grew up on a farm, didn't exist. I went back to our house that night and looked at our wedding photos. I looked at the woman in the white dress, promising to love me until death. I realized then that the Sarah I married was a ghost, a carefully crafted mask designed to blend into the Midwest and provide a layer of respectability to whatever dark business she and Sterling were truly running. If you were in my shoes, discovering your partner had an entire second identity, when would you confront them immediately or keep digging? Share your thoughts in the comments. I didn't break. I didn't go home and scream. I didn't pack her bags and throw them on the lawn. Instead, I did what I do best. I looked at the structural integrity of the situation. If Sarah was Elena and she was moving assets, that meant she was preparing for a final move. She was getting ready to leave me. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focus. I told Sarah I had an emergency project in Springfield and stayed at a Motel 6 across town. From that room, I went through every page of the Private Investigator's file. I mapped out her movements, her bank transfers, and the dates of her meetings with Sterling. Vance found the final piece of the puzzle on a Wednesday afternoon, a power of attorney form. See, Sarah had somehow forged my signature, or maybe she'd slipped it into a stack of business papers I'd signed months ago without looking, granting Julian Sterling full access to our home equity line of credit. They weren't just leaving. They were going to strip me of everything I owned before they vanished. The house I'd spent a decade paying for, the savings I'd built for our future children. It was all being funneled into the Elena Sterling escape fund. My wife wasn't just a liar, she was a predator, and I was the prey. I closed the file and felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. The time for spying was over. The time for the truth had come. I didn't go back to the house that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of Julian Sterling, the man who owned the name my wife was using in secret. I needed to see him with my own eyes, not through the grainy lens of a P.I.'s telephoto camera. I needed to see the man who was dismantling my life. I spent the next morning parked 3 blocks away from the Sterling development offices in a nondescript rental car Vance had helped me secure. I watched the glass doors like a hawk. At 11:15 a.m., he emerged. He looked exactly like the photos, but seeing him in motion was different. He moved with a predatory grace, a man who had never known a day of true manual labor in his life. He climbed into a black Mercedes AMG that roared with the sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I followed him. I kept 3 cars back, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack. He led me to a secluded park on the edge of Lake Michigan. He didn't go to a bench or a cafe. He walked toward a silver Lexus, Sarah's car. I watched through binoculars from behind a cluster of pines. They didn't embrace. There was no kiss of a lover. Instead, Sarah handed him a thick, heavy envelope. He opened it, fanned through a stack of $100 bills, and nodded. They spoke with the intense, clipped efficiency of 2 soldiers planning a raid. Sarah looked frantic, her hands flying as she spoke, while Sterling remained a statue of ice. He reached out and gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of ownership. He whispered something that made her flinch. Then he turned and walked back to his Mercedes. Sarah stayed in her car for a long time, her forehead resting against the steering wheel. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a cheating wife. When I was dealing with a woman who was trapped in a game much bigger than our marriage, and I was the collateral damage. I beat her home by 30 minutes. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the high-backed leather chair in the corner of the living room, the one Sarah had bought for my 35th birthday. The house felt like a tomb, a beautiful, expensive tomb filled with furniture bought with stolen dreams. When the garage door groaned open, I didn't move. I heard her heels clicking on the hardwood, the sound of her keys hitting the marble entryway, the hum of her humming a tune I didn't recognize. She walked into the living room and gasped, her hand flying to her chest when she saw my silhouette in the dark. "Elias, God, you scared me. I thought you were staying in Springfield another night." She reached for the light switch. "And don't," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone colder, someone I didn't know yet. "Leave it off, Sarah, or Elena, whichever one you're feeling like tonight." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear the wind rattling the window pane. But I couldn't hear her breathe. She stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, she reached out and flicked the lamp on the side table. The light flooded the room, hitting the manila folder I had placed on the coffee table. "How long?" she asked. No denial. "No, what are you talking about?" Just a cold, calculated question. "Long enough to know that everything I've built for 10 years is a lie," I replied. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy. "Long enough to know about the offshore accounts, the property in Oregon, and the fact that you're married to Julian Sterling." She didn't cry. I think that was the part that hurt the most. If she had broken down, if she had begged, I could have found a shred of the woman I loved inside her. But she just sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking at the folder with the detached interest of a doctor examining an X-ray. "Julian isn't my husband, Elias," she said, her voice flat. "He's my handler. And yes, legally, we are married. We had to be for the assets to move the way they did before I met you." "A handler?" I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "What is this, Sarah? A spy novel? You're an architect. You design libraries and office buildings." "I design paths for money to disappear, Elias," she snapped, her eyes finally showing a spark of something, anger or maybe fear. "When the firms I worked for, they weren't interested in blueprints. They were interested in shells. I was good at it. Too good. Julian found me when I was 22, and he's owned me ever since." She claimed she had met me to hide, to create a clean life that would act as a firewall between her and the people Julian worked for. She claimed she grew to love the life we had. But as she spoke, all I could see were the forged signatures on our home equity line. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in my story, and share your thoughts in the comments. "If you loved me," I whispered, "why are you stealing the house? Why is Sterling's name on the power of attorney?" Sarah looked away, her gaze fixing on a wedding photo on the mantel, the one where we were laughing on a beach in Maui. Because the debt followed us, Elias. Julian messed up a deal in Dubai 3 years ago. The people he answers to don't take apologies. They take payment. He told me that if I didn't give them the equity in this house, they'd come for you. I was trying to buy your safety." It was a beautiful story. For a second, I almost believed it. I almost wanted to reach out and hold her. But then I remembered the photo of her laughing with Sterling in the Gold Coast. I remembered the kiss on the cheek at the park. "Vance found the flight logs, Sarah," I said, pulling a final sheet of paper from the folder. "You weren't paying off a debt in Miami. You were scouting properties for a new life, a life without me. You weren't saving me, you were harvesting me." The mask finally crumbled. Her face twisted into something ugly, something sharp. And what did you think was going to happen, Elias? You're a builder. You're a good man. But you're simple. You were never meant to be more than a chapter. I gave you 10 good years. Most people don't even get that." The simple comment hit me harder than the betrayal. It was the ultimate condescension. She had looked down on the very stability and honesty she claimed to crave. I realized then that there was no Sarah. There was only the predator and the prey. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone. "No, you aren't," she said, her voice dangerously calm. She opened her handbag, the one I'd bought her for our anniversary, and pulled out a small, sleek pistol. It looked like a toy in her delicate hand, but the barrel was very real. "Julian is outside, Elias. If you make a scene, things get very complicated very quickly. Just let me take the bag in the car. You keep the house, or what's left of it. We vanish, and you never see us again. That's the deal." I looked at the woman I'd shared 10 years of my life with. She was holding a gun on me in our living room. The absurdity of it was almost enough to make me laugh. "You're going to shoot me? In our house? With the neighbors 20 feet away?" "I don't want to," she said, and for the first time, her voice trembled. "But I won't go back to what I was before Julian. I won't." She didn't shoot. She couldn't do it. Or maybe she realized that a dead husband is much harder to explain than a missing wife. She backed out of the room, her eyes never leaving mine, and bolted through the front door. I heard the Lexus scream out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I sat in the dark for 3 hours. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Vance. I just sat there surrounded by the wreckage of a decade. When the sun started to peek through the blinds, I finally picked up the phone. But I didn't call 911. I called the one person who knew exactly where they were going. "Julian," I said when Vance picked up. "They're on the move. Did you get the tracker on the Mercedes?" "Clockwork, Elias," Vance rasped. "They're heading for a private airfield in Gary, Indiana. If you want to stop them, you have about 40 minutes. I didn't want to stop them. I wanted to finish them. I told Vance to execute the Plan B we had discussed in his office, the one that involved the digital evidence we'd gathered. If you were in my shoes facing a person who held a gun to your head after 10 years of marriage, would you still try to protect them, or would you burn it all down?"